Agile, yeah! Hey, welcome back to the Agile Product Owner. Today we're going to be talking about tips for making sure that your sprint retrospective meetings are valuable for your developers. This is a question that I came across on Reddit a few weeks ago, and I thought it was a great question, and I felt like I had something to share regarding it from my perspective and my experience, and so I am going to do that right now. But anyways, tips for making sure that your sprint retrospective meetings are valuable for your developers. Yeah, so this, depending on the environment that you're in and the mindset of your development team, your Scrum team, if you are using the Scrum methodology in particular, this can be a real challenge. Developers, in my experience, software engineers, developers are not particularly strong communicators. Not all the time, at least. Sometimes they really enjoy communicating, but they do so in such a technical kind of genius level speak that they come off as a little bit robotic and nigh unintelligible to, your average Joe kind of walking around on the street or on the campus or in your work environment, your stakeholders. Sometimes they just don't like communicating at all. They don't want to be here in this meeting. They'd rather be sitting at their desk coding, or they're shy and afraid to speak up, afraid to express an unpopular opinion or to put themselves out there, and it's just not in their wheelhouse. And it makes sense. It really isn't a core part of their duties, these kind of soft skills. I think they're incredibly valuable for developers, and I would suggest that anybody out there who's considering a career in software development put some time into kind of building out your communication skills. But it's not uncommon for developers to not enjoy an hour, 2 hour long, God help me, 2 hours long sprint retro. So anyway, so this comes up a lot, and I have some tips for how to kind of avoid it. So your potential pitfalls, 3 of them that I've seen surfaced in the past. Your first issue, developers feel like the retro is kind of useless. This is what I was talking about before, where if you're not in a flow state on code, then you're wasting your time. This also comes up where your retro kind of devolves into a gripe session. This is particularly dangerous when it's griping about things that are outside of your control, external dependencies. Like this would come up a lot with my Scrum teams, where we need a firewall hole punched, or a new credential set up, an environment spun up, and a virtual machine spun up. And the teams that we were working with, within the same IT organization, mind you, were not always particularly quick to respond. And so tickets would regularly get blocked by these external dependencies. And it happened so much and to such a severe degree at the University of Colorado where I worked that it was a regular rant topic in our retros, basically. And it's almost all we would do in the retro, to be honest, is the developers would just kind of work each other up into a loop. This was a group of 8, 9, 10 developers. They would just kind of work themselves up into a frenzy, and as a result, a lot of people would come out of it feeling like the retro was kind of useless because all we did was complain about things that we can't control anyways. And then the other kind of key issue that I've often come across is, how do you keep the developers engaged in the retro? You're doing these things. If you're on a 2-week sprint cadence, you're doing this every 2 weeks, a long ceremony. Depending on how you schedule your ceremonies, it could be a long ceremony and a long day of ceremonies, and people tend to, zone out or not feel free to express themselves. And so how do you kind of work around that potential pitfall? And so down here, I've got my potential solutions. Okay, so first of all, developers feeling like the retro is useless. To me, the remedy to this is to really focus the retro on generating a list of continuous improvement action items. I should add that to the slide here. Continuous improvement. I swear I can spell better than that, just not in a live video. Continuous improvement action items on the ways that the development team can improve their own workflows and processes. Right? So make it clear when you're going into it. When we come out of this meeting, we want to have a list of just a couple of things that we can do to improve our work. Things that are within our locus of control. That's very important as well, because these two issues to me are birds of a feather, and so the solutions to them are similar as well, and they're linked essentially. So go into the retro, make it clear what we want to accomplish in this meeting is to inspect the previous sprint and the previous increment and come out of the ceremony with a list of things we can do to improve. And what I would do is I would just export that list of action items out of the tool that we were using. In this case, I was using Retrium, which I'm going to show off here in a minute, and throw it into a Google Doc. And the key is you have to make sure that your Scrum team is not just screaming into the void. In other words, great, you tell them you're going to make a list of continuous improvement action items. You write them down. Then you do nothing with them. Or you just never mention them again. And that generates this sentiment. These retros are useless. So what I would do is I would come out of the retro, I would immediately document these things in a shared Google Doc, and then I would bring them up during the sprint whenever the following sprints, whenever it was appropriate. Like for instance, during sprint planning, prior to starting the planning session, I would say, let's take a look at our continuous improvement action items from our retros. And I would have a few that I would keep at the top of the list that were bookmarked, that were kind of evergreen, stuff like we want to make sure that the sprint has a clear, single sentence, achievable goal that we will use as our primary means of measuring success, things like that. So, number one, potential solution, make the focus of the retro coming up with a couple of actions that the Scrum team can take that are within their locus of control to improve their workflows and processes, and then regularly surface that list and just talk about it. Sometimes there are items that will come out of that are so specific that I'll actually assign them to people with their consent. Of course, all this, everything I do is done collaboratively. I don't do anything in a vacuum. I don't dictate anything. I consider the product owner to be a part of the Scrum team, and therefore not empowered to dictate, to the rest of the Scrum team. We're a team of equals, and then just regularly surface it and talk about it. Like I said, potentially assign items, ask for volunteers. Who wants to take this item about cleaning up our documentation on GitHub, or our in-code documentation? and standardizing it a little bit. Oh, okay, Amon's going to go off and do a little bit of research on best practices in that regard, and then we'll talk about them, in asynchronously in Teams or in our next, stand-up or wherever it comes up. So that's my first suggestion, to push past this issue of developers feeling like the retro is useless. Regarding the retros devolving into a never-ending gripe session, and I'm being very PC by using the word gripe here instead of the word that I want to use, particularly about things that are outside of our control. And again, I talked about this kind of in the previous item, but I just always tried to steer the conversation towards two very specific topics. What happened during the previous sprint, so the previous and the previous sprint's increment, and on things that are within the software development team's control. And I found that this was very effective in terms of steering the conversation. Again, it's not a dictate. Don't talk about anything that didn't happen in the previous sprint. It's just a suggestion and a gentle nudge. Hey, we want to leave room for these developers, for the Scrum team to vent. We want to leave room for the ranting about the platform engineering team and how they take 2 months to get our VMs set up and what have you. But ultimately, the retro is supposed to be a collaborative reflection on the previous sprint that aids in continuous improvement. And I found that keeping the focus on the previous sprint and on things that are within our control helps with that and mitigates this issue of my retros are just a nightmare of rage emotion expression, group rage emotion expression. And then this question of how do you keep the developers engaged in the retro? And the thing that I found to be the most valuable in that case is just to mix up the format. And I accomplished that by using a tool called Retrium, which I thought I would demo here at the end as kind of a bonus. Basically, you come in here, it'll ask you, are you participating or are you facilitating the retro? Again, I was a product owner by trade. I was paid to be a product owner, but I was also facilitating all of the ceremonies. And you just create a new retro, and then when you do so, you have a ton of options on what kind of retro do you want to run, and you've got various other kind of tools here. So you can work in the kind of sticky notes tab and just do a simple what went well, what didn't. Sometimes this is nice particularly if it was a rough sprint and there were a lot of people out of the office and maybe you're worried about engagement. Keeping it simple. What went well, what didn't go well. And you can see here it'll preview what it would look like. It's just 2 buckets, and the participants all have the ability to create notes under each bucket, and we'll walk through that here in a minute, and I'll show you an example of a retro run through Retrium. A lot of times we would do a start, stop, continue. My team really liked the 4 L's: liked, learned, lacked, and longed for. Wishes, risks, appreciations, and puzzles. This is nice because it's a retro format that allows you to express appreciations, which I think can sometimes potentially get lost, especially in something like a start, stop, continue, for example, or what went well, And then you have all these different techniques that you can try to dive into. I always dreamed about running a Scrum Values retro. We never got around to it, but I would have loved to talk about the Scrum Values because I'm obsessed with Agile and Scrum, and it just all kind of syncs mentally with where I'm at. So I always wanted to run one of these, never got to. The Scrum Ceremonies one is really cool too. How can you improve your Scrum Ceremonies with kind of like this starfish, design that you build out and leave notes on. And there's all sorts of stuff in here. You can do a fishbone to find the root cause of an issue, an RCA. but we'll just hop into a basic start, stop, continue. So you kick it off, let's retrospect, you grab the URL, send it to your team. Obviously, you have to pay for Retrium. I have no concept of what the cost is. And I've used this even for things like project reviews, post-project reviews. So what did we learn in this project? So you create a couple of custom columns, what went well, what didn't. And then everybody who is present gets to see the board. And so you kick it off and you say, okay, I'm going to time box this for 5 minutes. Really important to time box your retros so that they don't ramble like this video does. Everybody start putting in notes, and then boom, people start adding notes, and the notes fill up. This retro sucks. Or we need clear direction from leadership on our strategic goals. Then once that time box expires or people are done putting in notes, you'll hear this sound, and then you move on to the group phase. So it'll give you a quick warning. Yes, let's go. And then you start kind of piling these things into groups, or, almost kind of like epics. Like, are these things related? Well, no, this one is really more about, this is feedback on the retro, and this is a process improvement, so these wouldn't be grouped, but you can group things together, and then you move on to the vote phase. And everybody who is participating will get a certain number of votes based off of the number of cards that are generated during the ideation stage, and you can vote on them by clicking them. And then you move on to the discuss phase, and it'll show you in kind of ranked order based off number of votes, the most popular topics. And then what I would do is I would typically time box a discussion of 10-minute maximum on each topic, and you get through maybe 2 or 3 of them, maybe 4 if you're lucky. And as you're going along, again, you're creating those action items. That's the Director of Software Engineering for an update on our strategic direction in the next sprint. Stand up parking lot. You can assign these things and set a target completion date. I pretty much just captured them here and then exported them out of Retrium and tracked them outside of that. Then finally, when you go to the wrap-up, it'll let all the participants vote on, was this a good use of your time, yes or no? And obviously you're looking for 4s and 5s. This is really helpful too because, again, it's anonymous. All this is anonymous. So it tends to pull people out of their shell, people who might not want to participate if they were sitting in a room together and writing on different colored stickies where it's obvious who surfaced a certain issue. This tends to also facilitate hard discussions, again, because there is that anonymous structure to it. People can bring up issues that they have within the Scrum team or with their colleagues or with leadership, things that might not come up otherwise. But anyways, you vote on it, and then you get to reveal the results. Then you finish it up, and the retro, export your action items. Export to CSV. So that's my suggestion for how do I keep the developers engaged, is to just mix it up, try different things. Don't be afraid to try things. I mean, if you're agile, again, be agile, don't do agile. Think agile. Let's mix it up. Let's iterate, let's continuously improve, try different things. And Retrium just happens to be a tool that is good at facilitating that in kind of a delivered product that's easy to use, that's easy to teach people to use. So those are my thoughts on a couple of tips for making sure that your sprint retrospective meetings are valuable for your developers. Let me know in the comments if any of this is useful. Let me know. I'm interested because I am interested in iterating and in continuously improving this channel. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and I will talk to you later.